All right, RBT competency assessment. I'm a BCBA. This will be a mock practice of the measurement section of the RBT competency. I will go through and conduct this as if it was real life and your official one. So as I'm asking questions, pause, try to answer the question, see if you get it right. If not, come back to it after you've studied a little more. So let's jump right into it. So the first one would be continuous measurement, and all of these could be either with a client, role played, or interview style. So for continuous measurement, I'm going to be asking you about continuous measurement. So if I were to ask you what is frequency, you would say count. If I were to ask you to measure the frequency of nose touching, you would say 3. If I were to ask you what duration is, you would say the length of the behavior. If I were to ask you to measure the duration of me touching my nose, you might say 3 seconds. If I were to ask you what latency is the time between the SD and the beginning of the response. So if I were to ask you to measure the latency of nose touching, and I said touch your nose, you might get 2 seconds. And finally, if I were to ask you what inter-response time was, inter-response time is the length of time between the end of one behavior and the start of a similar behavior. So let's measure the IRT of nose touching. You might have got 3 seconds. There's 3 seconds between each touch of the nose. The next one will be discontinuous measurement. So that's partial, whole interval, and momentary time sampling. If I were to ask you what partial interval is, that's if the behavior occurs at all during the interval, you count it. If I were to ask you what whole interval measurement is, the behavior has to occur the entire duration of the interval for it to count. And if I were to ask you what momentary time sampling is, the behavior would have to occur at the end of the interval for it to count. So let's measure in 5-second intervals. Let's measure nose touching using partial interval. So you would record that as a yes because it occurred within the 5 seconds. Let's measure whole interval, 5 seconds of nose touching. You would count that as a no because it only occurred 1 second out of the 5. And then finally, let's measure momentary time sampling, nose touching. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That would be a yes because it occurred at the end of the interval at 5 seconds. And then finally for measurement, data and graphs. This is going to be dependent on where you work and how you take data, but you need to be familiar with the data taking system. So if I'm asking you again to measure frequency, I need to be able to see you can take count, however you guys do it. And then are you able to graph that data in whatever way you're required wherever you work.